Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. What happens when a clinical psychologist turns his lens on the global economy? You get one of the most original thinkers in green business today. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Espen Stoknes to Business Talk. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. Espen Stoknes is a Norwegian psychologist, economist, and associate professor at the Department of Leadership and Organizational Behavior at BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo. A rare thinker who bridges the inner world of the psyche with the outer urgencies of our planet. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Oslo and was originally trained as a clinical psychologist, a combination that gives his work a distinctive human-centered depth. He is perhaps best known globally for his TEDx talk on the psychology of climate communication, which has garnered over 3.3 million views, and for his award-winning book, What We Think About When We Try Not to Think About Global Warming, recognized as an outstanding academic title by the American Library Association. His most recent work includes Tomorrow's Economy, published by MIT Press, and Earth for All, co-authored with leading scientists including Dr. John Rockstrom and Dr. Jürgen Renders, under the banner of the Club of Rome, of which he is a full member. Beyond academia, Dr. Stoknes is a serial entrepreneur who co-founded the clean tech company Gas Plus and has served as a member of the Norwegian Parliament representing the Green Party from 2017 to 2021, where he sat on the Standing Committee on Finance. He has also served on the EU Commission's mission board of Horizon Europe's Climate Change and Societal Adaptation Program. A recipient of multiple Best Professor Award at BI Executive, he is known for his original and imaginative teaching style that blends strategy, green economics, and future thinking. For decades, we have been told that economic growth and environmental health are opposites. Dr. Espen Stoknes disagrees powerfully. In today's episode, he walks us through the central argument of tomorrow's economy, that healthy green growth is not only possible, but essential, more regenerative than wasteful, more equitable than extractive. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Espen Stoknes to the conversation. Professor Stoknes, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our kind invitation.
Thank you for such a warm and detailed introduction, Deepak. It's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, you deliberately moved beyond the tired pro-growth versus anti-growth debate and introduced the concept of healthy growth. In simple terms, how would you explain the difference between healthy and unhealthy economic growth to someone who has never thought of it in this way before?
So, GDP was introduced during the Second World War, particularly starting in the US and then spreading to the whole world. And it was a simple indicator to look at the total activity level and the output level of all the aggregated economy every year. And as everybody knows, it's been a very successful metric in the way that it has been spread and used widely, and everybody uses it, even if they don't really understand what it is. So the sum of all consumption in a country and also the sum of all production, along with the import and export, it gives a very good activity picture, how much that is changing from year to year. But it says nothing about how that economic activity is achieved. So when we hear whether GDP has gone up and down, we need to ask two more questions. One is how much natural resources was used to make that GDP growth, and the other is how much has it increased or decreased the inequality. So has it been a GDP growth that made the society more inclusive, or has it increased the inequality? These two additional productivity measures should be considered when you want to know whether a GDP growth is good or not, healthy or sick, and if you achieve it simply by pumping more oil and gas or more digging out of the soil or applying more fossil fertilizer that destroys the soil, then it's been a resource-intensive GDP. We use more of natural scarce resources to achieve a GDP growth, but you could say it's a gray growth. You cannot continue with this for too long before the productivity will start to fall. And then the social productivity has to do with who gets the GDP income. If all of it goes to the top 10% richest, then we know it's increasing inequality because the 40 to 50% lowest incomes, they do not keep up. So what we want is a GDP growth where you have capital growth. So yes, there is more dividends from the capital labor ratio. You invest in machines and computers and cities and good water infrastructure, but we also need to have investments in resource productivity. So we get more value with less resource use. And finally, we need to know that the value created is sent not just to the top 10%, but also to the bottom 40 or 50%. So it's a social productivity improvement, which means in a sentence, we have healthy growth if we have a resource productivity of a typically above 6 to 7% per year, and a social inclusivity of also increasing 5 to 6% per year. In that way, GDP growth is not a problem at all if only make sure you make more value with less resource use and more inclusiveness rather than inequality. That's my definition, Deepak, and I think it's super important to have that in mind when one considers the long-term feasibility of economic growth.
Professor, you used the powerful metaphor of a balance sheet for the planet. What does that balance sheet look like today? And what would it need to look like for us to say, yes, we are on the right track?
Super important question. And I also think that it's a nice follow-up to the previous question, because the annual flows of value creation, whether it is in the form of gross profit in a corporation or as a GDP, gross domestic product, as a nation, we need to look on the broad wealth on the balance sheet, not just on the annual flows of the income and loss sheet. So to know if we have a healthy economy, then the human capital that it goes into production needs to be improved. So education of the people, and also a re-enabling of people so they have a dignified work to go to and an income that is above the minimum living level. Second, we need to know how the ecosystems are developing, so the biocapacity of the value chains that we rely on. So the soils, the fresh water, the forests, and the clean air. So if that is declining over time, so the soil's capacity to contain organic carbon, the fresh quality of the fresh water, and so on, if that biocapacity is declining, then we know that we are extracting value to maximize the flows, but undermining the long-term value of the soil that we are depending on, and the forest and the ecosystems. The same thing goes with the social capital, which is a level of trust. How is the trust in society developing? And we can measure this also with questionnaires. So if you ask people, how much trust do you have in people generally, and you compare that with last year and people have less trust, then it's a decline or erosion of the social wealth. Similarly, you can ask, what is your trust in institutions like the police, the politicians, the local government, the national government, the justice system? And if people's trust is declining, that means also their well-being is declining. So what do you need to put on the balance sheet besides the monetary and the productive capital is also the state of the ecosystem or the natural capital and the social capital. And to get a healthy economy, you need an increase in your productive capital, an increase in the natural capital, and an increase in the social capital. At least the sum of those three should be net positive from one year to the next. So that is how I define and quantify a healthy economy. And we get there with a healthy growth, where we get more value per resource use and more value for particularly the lowest 50 in terms of their median income.
Professor, you are trained as a psychologist as well as an economist. How does your understanding of human behavior and mindset shape the way you think about economic transformation? Is our biggest barrier really psychological rather than technological?
In many ways, I would say they are, Deepak, because we have been conditioned and programmed, so to speak, of over-focusing on the short-term monetary incomes. This is a long story, and it starts approximately around 1494, where a monk in Italy called Luca Pacioli made the first double entry accounting with debit and credit, and the P&L and the balance sheet. And that has been trained over decades and centuries into us evaluating how things are going, how well am I doing in terms of my net income, and how well is my company doing. So now we need to rethink that and expand our sense of wealth. So when the well-being is stagnating in rich countries, for instance, that is a function of undermining social trust by inequality and polarization. And also, if the air is polluted and I cannot breathe well, or I suffer from health problems, then my well-being is no longer declining, even if my income has gone up. And we have been conditioned to think that success is having more than others. So we measure that in terms of money. So it's both an error in terms of looking only at a very narrow part of well-being and wealth, but also in terms of comparing ourselves to others. So what we see in rich countries is that even if the GDP or the income per person is going up, well-being is not going up. So it's actually going down. We think we are not as happy now as we were. Our quality of life is no longer increasing. In low-income countries, we know that the growth in the GDP or the average per person income, and particularly the median income, is connected to increasing well-being. So there is a strong connection in the beginning, but then after about $25,000 per person per year in PPP terms, there is no longer any clear gain. So we need to rethink what is a good life? What is economics for? And that's what I help to do in this book, to rethink growth. How can we want growth, we want personal growth, we want spiritual growth, we want growth in well-being, and we want growth in inclusiveness. So there are so many things that can grow, but certain things make no sense in growing anymore once you've reached a certain level. And that is how the psychology has been determined by money. So I often I say this, that money messes with our minds, and we need to rethink our relationship with money, particularly how it is connected to real values, such as the state of nature and also the state of communities and cities at a local level. So those things no longer correlate very well. So we have been writing also the book that you mentioned, Earth for All, to see how we could change this direction. And in the book Tomorrow's Economy, which you have gratefully put on your just beside you, we have 4 scenarios that attempt to look at how the world is developing as a whole as we rethink our relationship to economic growth. And sorry if I'm speaking too long. You must interrupt me if I...
That's fine, Professor, no problem. Professor, you make the compelling claim that we already have the tools to achieve healthy growth. What are the most powerful and underutilized tools that businesses and governments are simply not deploying at the scale we need?
So we have a remarkable capacity for innovation, and our global economy, particularly the modern type of economy that is more monetary, has gone through a number of revolutions since it started in the UK around 1750. The first was a revolution in innovation around steam engines and the use of coal for weaving and spinning. And then the next wave was in terms of trains and steel production. So we had the robber barons of the US coming and taking over the rail system. And then came a wave of mass consumption with assembly line and Henry Ford, who made the cars, etc., in 1900s. And briefly, we have a innovation wave based on the transistor that started after the Second World War. And now we have, of course, the ICT, mobile and AI revolution since the 1990s. In this, the main idea has been all along to replace humans with machines driven by fossil power, fossil energy. We have invested in machines particularly because they wanted to improve labor productivity growth, because labor productivity growth, getting more value per hour, has been the dominant logic of growing the GDP, growing the economy. Now we have new tools to look at not just how labor productivity investments can result in higher growth, but also resource productivity. Meaning we can think more circular economy, a set of tools that exist around that, and also not least energy efficiency and the shift from fossil energy to renewable energy. So we can redesign the way we provide end user value, utility. I want a comfortable temperature in my house. I want to get from A to B. I want clean clothes. I want good food. And there are so many ways we can do that without just investing in machines that replace humans in the supply chain. Now we have about 8 billion people on the planet. A lot of them are Indian. Most others are Chinese. Europe is a little part of that. So there are so many hands, so many people who want to work. And it doesn't make sense to throw all the money at AI or machinery that replaces people when you can work with more local resources in a smart way. So we reuse the resources and we provide local jobs by using less resources. No point in bringing billions of tons of oil out of the Hormuz Strait in big ships that then burn in some machine, one-off, then you have to go back. If you could rather have a rapid shift towards renewable energy that uses less end user energy to deliver the exact things we want in our house. Take, for example, a heat pump. Rather than using it to burn gas to make power and then run a heater or a cooler, we can rethink how we provide mobility. There's no point in making big car roads if you can design the city for being walkable. So rethinking, redesigning how we create good lives, particularly in cities, smart innovations from passive cooling systems, electric mobility, anything from e-bikes to, and of course, car share, ride share type of thing, mobility solutions. So we can, in 100 different ways, rethink our cities to have a higher quality of life with less resource use. And that is super also valuable economically because we shift the costs from wasteful supply chain to maximizing the comfort and utility at the end user stage. So one example for that is a company I know that is called Too Good To Go. And they look at the waste in the restaurant sector or the bakeries or other food shops, because at the end of the day, there was a lot of food waste and there are a lot of hungry people. So to avoid having to throw the food away, they have an app which makes it possible for you to bid. So you can put a little bid on the last dishes that are not sold, the last bread, the last fruit that is about to expire, and then you get that food to a very discounted price. So you convert wastefulness into nourishment for those who need, and the shops make more money, the people get cheaper food, and you avoid the food waste of the restaurant and the hotel and the shop business. But these are just a few examples of what a highly resource productive and high quality of life city or a country could look like. And there's nothing more I wish for than that India to apply all these principles to become a resource productive, inclusive economy with a high quality of life. I think that's the most important country in the world right now to see this shift accelerating. And I'm super happy to see at least a lot of the renewable energy is now rolling out, even if it maybe not is optimal quite yet. But everybody has to learn how to do this in a systemic way.
Professor, you advocate for the creation of a new legal entity, the Benefit Corporation. Why is this structural innovation so important, and what stops more companies from adopting this model today?
Super important question, Deepak. Thank you for raising that point. Not many journalists have picked up on this. So if I'm an executive and my incentive structure is based on the dividends that I can pay to shareholders, and the board is mainly focused on maximizing shareholder value every quarter, then it is difficult to do the transition because some of these investments like renewable energy, electrification, circular material flows, you need an upfront investment. And then as that capital is put into use and you learn how to use it, the profits, because you have a higher expense now and a higher capex, may go down in the short term. And then only when those innovations and investments start to pay off do I get the lower cost and the profit and the margins go back up. Now, some boards and some shareholders are very impatient. So they require the executive to maximize shareholder value in the short term because they are uncertain or they don't want to wait for the long term. In this case, some companies would fire the executives and then replace it with somebody else who increases the extraction rate and stops the investments of resource productivity and also maybe the education of employees or improving the worker conditions in the supply chain, because they see that as costs and not as an investment. If, however, there is a change in the articles of association, so to be shareholder in this company and to be as a board, you have to respect the articles of association. And in the purpose, the first article of the articles of association, you have to write that this company shall seek a balanced outcome of terms of financial, natural, and social capitals. If that is the case, then the board can easily defend to accept a lower than maximum dividend to the shareholder in the short term in order to prioritize the long term. And in some jurisdictions, such as part of the US, activist shareholders could sue the company if they prioritized long-term resource productivity, restoration, or regenerative projects, or they give too much to the value chain or to the employees because they feel that it's my right as a shareholder to maximize my dividends every year, every quarter even. And a public benefit corporation puts it into the purpose of the articles of association that it shall seek a balanced approach. In that way, I, as an executive, would ask maybe my board to have a more balanced incentive structure with KPIs from at least one of the three values, and my incentives would be aligned with a broader, healthy economy development. Otherwise, we know many examples. For instance, Unilever had a shareholder fight, and they took away the manager who replaced Paul Pullman because he prioritized sustainability too high. And the same thing with with Danone, a French dairy company. Their CEO was thrown out because he wanted to invest in the farmers and the milk production capacity. So that's a very important thing, to make sure that companies can align with the long-term interests of society, workers, nature, but also shareholders. So it's not a loss for the shareholders. It's only a loss for those who want to maximize always the short-term return and then get out of the company maybe. So it's a inoculation against what you could call overly greedy capitalism, or the gray growth capitalism.
Professor, you outlined 6 concrete steps that companies can take toward healthy growth. Without giving everything away, which of these 6 steps do you find most companies resist the most, and why?
I'm happy to give a lot of things away, Deepak. It's a good model, and we use it at my business school executive MBA programs every year. So just last Friday now, I had also people from India in my executive MBA programs. So the 6 steps are, briefly, you can do things at the outreach level, which is to say that you work with your local community, you work with your maybe trade body, and you can lobby for better regulation of the whole sector. You can give employees some time free to work with NGOs in the area. So it's all about outreach and connecting with the stakeholders that the company is dependent and also relating with. The next level of the green growth stairs is when you go to the house cleaning part. And at that time, you need to, shall we say, make sure your buildings are energy efficient. You need to make sure your waste is handled in a safe way, so you're compliant with the rules. You need to get maybe a climate and accounting in place, and also environment management system. Maybe you may even want to invite your employees to be on the board, and you can create good ideas, post box type of sharing. So you involve the employees in making the workplace clean, efficient, and healthy. So that's the house cleaning part. The next step is when you start to apply that to your suppliers. So now you would require suppliers you buy things from to have a cleaned up value chain. So they should at least have the same high level as you have yourself in terms of energy efficiency, carbon accounting, safe toxic handling, recycling and take back options, etc. So we call that for greening procurement. And also making sure that you can verify that the company that sells cleaner products actually do that, either by having audits or by sharing audit information with other buyers. Something that, for instance, the electronic sector industry body called Responsible Business Alliance are doing with Philips and ABB and other big purchasers of electronics. The next step is the greening operations, and here we try to avoid the loss of energy, heat recapture where you produce your stuff, and maybe also avoid sending things to landfill by finding ways of reusing fractions, or maybe find off-takers. So how can we run our operations in a more energy efficient way? If it's too cold over here and it's too warm over there, then you can put a heat exchanger and you can insulate your production process so that you don't waste more energy as you make it. 100 ways to rethink the systems of productions where the operations happen. And if you're a logistical company, then the transition from diesel to electric trucks, for instance, is very important in that aspect. The 5th level is the product portfolio. Here, we shift our product portfolios from gray and wasteful products to green and circular products. So we avoid toxic materials, because then you can redesign the product to being reusable and durable. And also in terms of services, if I have very energy intensive services, I can replace those with more resource productive services and project leadership. And so I integrate resource productivity framework in how we deliver projects or knowledge to our customers. And finally, it's the business model. So it's outreach, house cleaning, procurement, operations, product portfolio, and finally, how the business model can turn to be more circular or dematerialized. So rather than selling books, we can sell digital books. Rather than selling like the old CDs, we now stream from Spotify. And Airbnb is another example of underutilized real estate can become an income just by changing it. So we don't have to build more hotels and so on. Solar installations can be done as a service. You lease the upfront cost and you have somebody install it. So suddenly I can have solar as a service on my roof rather than having to own those solar panels. So all these 6 steps are universal steps that any company can take up the value chain. My experience, Deepak, and that's your question, the steps that companies can take, they easily do the house cleaning stuff, but many resist going deep into their value chain. They often just ask the supplier, but not asking the supplier to look with the sub-supplier, because then you get into the whole wastefulness of the supply chain, and that becomes more complex if you have 100 suppliers. So they usually end up just buying the cheapest and at short term. So if operations or sales say, oh, we need 5 of this immediately, then I call around or I search the internet and come up with the cheapest option without knowing if that product will last long, whether it can be maintained and repaired, or it can be a take back. So we reduce the life cycle cost. So going into depth on the green purchasing, I would say is a super important step, because you can have a deep impact beyond your own operations down into the supply chain. So that's one step I see a lot of companies struggle with, getting control over their supply chain and purchasing, and also in a way that could form long-term partnership with the suppliers, so that if the supplier has a very bright innovation, but it takes some time to get there, maybe you need a partnership where you say, if you invest in those cleaner products, then we will buy from you so much, at least every year in 5 years. In that way, the supplier would have a reason to invest because they know they could deliver to you over time. So purchasing is super important, and a lot of people do a lot of product innovation. So there's a lot of available product portfolios that could shift, but sometimes the business model needs to change as well. So partnering with your customers on how you can deliver more value for your customer in a dematerialized way is often quite difficult, because it have to go away from the conventional sales model where you push as much as you can. Now you have to partner with your customers, and that's how the new so we say resource productive and circular business model looks like. For instance, with extended product take back. So if I sell a car, I could have a take back option, and because I made that car, I know how to dismantle it and use the materials for a new car later. In that way, we could close the loop and make more of the materials come back to us, whether it's plastics or metals or batteries, and avoiding that to become wastefulness and pollution in the areas that our customers live. So if you ask me, I would say procurement and the business model shift. Those are difficult.
Professor, there is a lot of noise around sustainability and green business today. Much of it's greenwashing. How do you distinguish genuine regenerative growth from what is simply rebranded business as usual with a green label?
Again, a super important question, Deepak, and thanks for asking that. So we all live on the same Earth, Mother Earth. And as all know, everybody knows by now, we are pushing the planetary boundaries beyond a safe operating zone. So we are, in terms of CO2 emissions, is making too much global heat stay close to the Earth. And of course, India is the most vulnerable to this of many countries. In addition, we're losing biodiversity and we are losing forests that we need to maintain a long-term biodiversity and a safe cloud evapotranspiration atmosphere. We are overusing freshwater systems and putting too much nutrients into soils that run off and make eutrophication of coasts and freshwater lakes, etc. So based on these earth system science understandings, a lot of work has gone into establish what can be the safe threshold zone where we don't risk accelerated triggering tipping points that then become irreversible in terms of declining life supporting systems. These are often global, not all of them are global. Fresh water, for instance, is local, but climate and nutrients are particularly climate, but also nutrient flows. Too much nitrogen, bioactive nitrogen, ends up in the ocean, which is a global common. So we can decide how much we need to reduce the physical material use so that the economy can thrive and grow within the safe boundary zone. And that's what true sustainability is about, making sure that we said we have a healthy development in nature and society. So we need to translate these big global and national issues to something that is relevant to the corporation, to each corporation. The best way to do that, in my opinion, is to look at how big is the GDP for relative to each company. So the gross profit, or the gross margin of a company, if you add that up to all companies in a country, then you get to the GDP. So if you then look at your gross profits as a company relative to how much emissions or how much nitrogen or how much forest you use, depending on what kind of resource and supply chain you're mostly dependent on, then you can say, how much do you have to improve every year to do your fair share to make the whole economy get back into the safe zone? That means we can calculate an annual rate of change in the resource productivity. So if Tata is excellent in making steel, which the country and the world needs, but doing it with ever less coal or ever less emissions from the coal, then they can be part of the solution. The same thing with big food companies, but also every farmer or every food company, they need to make more food with less fossil fertilizer use. And we should remember that 70% of all fossil fertilizer ends up as evaporation or as runoff, and only 10 to 5% end up in nutrients for us that are actually eaten. But there's a lot of waste, both in the energy system and the food system. So the real challenge is to convert that wastefulness into value, make more value with less resource by using smarter solutions. And then I will define a genuine regenerative growth, because if you have then, on average, a 7% improvement in resource productivity every year, then you're part of the genuine green growth. If it's 5% or less, then you're part of the problem, because we cannot grow that way without causing unnecessary damage to what nourishes us. Regenerative means to honor that which feeds us, or to feed that which feeds us back. And that means changing our current wasteful system into a resource productive one at a high speed, or annual speed of a 5, 6, 7% change per year. So for instance, how can a company, if you are in the food business, make 7% more value from the food relative to the fertilizer we use? Well, we know that up to 30% of the harvest often is lost due to lack of cooling, good logistics, proper packaging, or ends up in places or shops where not enough is bought, while other places there is a high demand but not a supply. So rethinking the whole value chain from soil to table, and making sure that we nourish more people with less waste along the whole value chain is a way for a food company to have a higher resource productivity. And if you're a steel company, or if you're a car company, or if you are a logistics company, the same issue is, how can we make more value by burning less fossil carbon, electrifying at a rate of 6, 7, 8% per year? In that way, we're part of the solution. We're changing wasteful sectors into future resource productive and healthy economy sectors. So it's a very clear and global threshold. So for instance, if India wants to grow at 7 or 8% per year, then it means it can keep its resource use stable and its emissions stable. You don't have to cut CO2 emissions. But if a rich country like Norway or Germany or UK, they cannot grow at 7%. No way, they will have no chance. But if they grow at 1 to 2%, then they should cut by 5, 6, 7%, and then they would have a 7, 8% resource productivity. In this way, it is also a very dynamic and inclusive indicators, because it allows the low-income countries to grow much quicker, and the high-income countries need to cut much faster in order to have the same resource productivity. So in a way, it can be applied in any sector, for any city, in any country, for any company. Every time you don't compete with some kind of regulator, or you can compete with yourself. So how good am I this year compared to the previous year? And then next year, how much better do I need to be than I am now to be part of the solution? So I think those are very interesting progress indicators when you compare the value added to the resource use, and the value added also relative to how you distribute it, how much goes to the shareholder versus how much goes to those low-income employees that we have in our company. So in that way, you can measure a genuine inclusion and a genuine healthy growth rate also in terms of resource productivity. Yeah, I think that's it, Deepak. Too much?
Yeah, perfect, Professor. Professor, you place the engaged citizen at the center of the shift, the idea of voting with our wallets. But with rising cost of living globally, is conscious consumption a realistic expectation for the average person, or is this a privilege of the wealthy?
Super important question. And remember, I wrote this book sitting in Norway and in Europe, and a lot of the audience I expected to be American, UK, or Norwegian. And you're right. It is a certain privilege of the high-income countries to have more opportunity to choose whether I want to buy a greener product or a gray product. Maybe the greener one is a little bit more expensive, and still I can afford it. So it's a privilege, but then also maybe a duty. So you should expect more of consumers in rich countries compared to consumers in low-income countries. So in a low-income country, the most important thing is to survive, often to just get the nourishment. And then only later, once you have crossed maybe the threshold of about $20,000 to $25,000 per person, should we expect that also consumers in low-income countries should be able to pay a little bit more if the greener products are more expensive than the most, shall we say, the grayer products. But also I would like to say that this is also a question for the producers and for the government. So when in the low-income country, the government should maybe require that the food that is made available also is coming from a healthy and toxics-free value chain in order to support a supply chain that nourishes everybody, not just the rich people in the low-income countries. And similarly, I think also like Unilever, when they had a sustainable living plan, they measured one of their KPIs as a producer in terms of how many people are we reaching with a healthy diet. So we shouldn't expect too much of low-income country consumers, and we should then expect more of the government in this country and also the companies that provide food to these underserved, very often, customers. And this applies also actually to high-income countries. For instance, in the US, there are parts of the cities where low-income families live, and there are many food deserts there, highly or ultra-processed, unhealthy food with too much starch, salt, and fats that are saturated, which makes them ill. So they are pushing unhealthy food at the low-income country, low-income segment people, and making them ill, in addition to having to work too much. So I think that this question of a fair and inclusive diet approach is something that applies to both low-income and high-income countries, but in different ways. And of course, I would not put it on the shoulders of a low-income consumer to have to buy greener products if those are more expensive, which they often are in some areas.
Professor, you argue that healthy growth should be redistributive by design. That is a bold statement in a world where inequality is still widening. What does equity by design actually look like in corporate or policy level?
At the corporate level, it means when a company reports to the shareholders or to their annual reports, they should look at not just how much value is created, like the EBITDA or the gross profits, but also how that value creation is distributed. So how much of this is given to shareholders, how much is given to employees, how much is given paid in tax where the value is created, and how much is given back in terms of interest rate payments to the financial system. So banking, government, employees, and shareholders, and these are the four groups that receive money from the value creation. Now, if I see a development from one year to the next that, now we're giving less to the employees and we're giving more to the shareholders, then this company clearly is increasing inequality because fewer are shareholders than employees. So if you cut wages to give more to the shareholders, you are clearly generating inequality and making the society less inclusive. So that's a very clear way to measure the value added and distributed, which some reporting systems require. I would strongly recommend all Indian companies to disclose this. And then everybody can see how they are prioritizing between these four different interest groups in the corporation. For a policy level, having an inclusive policy, I think what we need to do, particularly now that AI is coming, is to start taxing more on the resource use. So whether that is coal or gas or biomass that we take from the earth, but also maybe patents and urban real estate value, because everybody wants to live in the center and that increases the value of the urban disproportionately and makes it often too difficult, too expensive for people to live in the center, so they have to move out and you have an expense in terms of traveling back and forth, commuting. So by taxing some of the common wealth or the common pools and then giving that back to all citizens equally, we call that in the Earth for All report a citizen universal basic dividend. So all citizens should have a fair share of the wealth dividends that the country as a whole is providing. We could also, of course, have more progressive taxes that could do some of the same thing. In that way, if everybody got a certain payment as part of their predictable income on top of their working income, that would make the whole society more inclusive. And not just that, is a kind of distributive policy, it's also good for growth, because when you give money to the lowest income segments, most of that money is used for consumption because they really need it, and that money then stimulates supply again. So you have then a more, what you call, more rapid velocity of money. The money is circulating rather than sitting still in the assets of the most rich top percent, or being used to speculation, which is not real value creation. So by circulating money back to the lowest 40% in particular, you would stimulate the overall growth rate of the economy, which is also good for the richest. In that way, society can become more inclusive, use less resources, and increase the well-being of the majority. And this is the vision that we have modeled in Earth for All and also Tomorrow's Economy with a quantitative approach. And we can see it works well in the model. And also, I think China, for instance, has been able to do that. Over the last 20 years, they have lifted 800 million people out of poverty into a middle-class standard, and Korea did it before. And now I see the tendency coming in India, even if I know it's very uneven and many troubles, many challenges, I know, but still it's a vision that I think can be done if these policies and technologies are rolled out across the economy.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If a young business leader, entrepreneur, or policymaker picks up tomorrow's economy today, what is the single most important mindset shift you hope they walk away with? And where do you believe the most exciting opportunities for healthy growth lie in the next decade?
So for a young business leader and entrepreneur, I would love them to become engaged and enthusiastic in broad wealth creation. Not just short-term maximize profits, but see how the profits can be reinvested in a broad wealth and be a partner in creating a healthy economy. And I think the most exciting opportunities for healthy growth lies not only in calculating resource productivity and social productivity, but developing new ways of accounting for value. So for instance, biodiversity credits are certificates that we have invested in a certain number of hectares or in a watershed. So now we can prove that there is less polluted water thanks to our investments. And that is a value paper which should be acknowledged as such, and maybe even given a shadow price or being used to pay tax. So you can have a buyer of last resource. But it is a new type of accounting, not just dollars, but also hectares of healthy nature. And similarly, in terms of human relationships and trust, if we can document that an area had a lower level of trust, and now we do things, and their well-being and trust level increases, those are social entrepreneurship certificates that should have a certain value. You know you have invested in the relationships there, and that should be acknowledged as important as maximizing your short-term profits in the long run.
Listeners, Tomorrow's Economy is not just a book, it's a call to action. And today's conversation has made that call louder and clearer. Dr. Stoknes, thank you for joining us on Businesstalk. You have left us with much to think about, and more importantly, much to do. Thank you once again.
Wonderful to be with you, Deepak, and I really, really liked your questions. You've seen the essence of the book, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you.